Hi, I'm Brad. Help me. Today we are finally reviewing the Quest 3 VR headset, or mixed reality headset, I guess. So this headset has been out for longer than a month now, actually, almost 2 months actually. And while it normally takes me a long time to do a definitive review of a headset, these headsets are difficult than your standard PCVR headset. And while I do mostly use these as PCVR, whether wirelessly tethered using an application like AirLink or more commonly virtual desktop for me, there's just so many features that they constantly pack into these things every year that it's really hard for me to discern whether a feature is a gimmick early on because, I've been doing this for a while, right? I started doing VR YouTube back in 2016 with the Vive, and back then it seemed like that technology was going to explode at an exponential rate back then. Everyone has a honeymoon effect with hardware, and especially with VR hardware. So it's really good to kind of take a long time to dive into every single little feature and see what features that release on day one actually matter in the long term, right? So I think at this point, I can definitely say what I like and dislike about the device and certain features about it. So first off, let me just premise this whole video by saying I like this headset. In fact, I like it a lot. I didn't really like it out of the box, but we'll get into that when we get into like the industrial design sort of opinions I have about it. But overall, I do think this is probably the only standalone headset that I've liked for a long period of time and can see myself using. And not only that, coming from Meta, who is a company that historically I still have never really appreciated, I can still heavily appreciate the hardware and work that's gone into this and leave it at that. If you go back to my Quest Pro video from last year, you'll notice that I gave that headset a pretty scathing review. And it frustrated me because I was excited back then about two things. One, I was excited about Meta kind of dipping their toes back into high-end, expensive hardware for VR because I still think that is incredibly valuable at this current stage of the market. I think limiting yourself to price is really problematic. I think you should make it good before you make it cheap. And while that might be difficult for getting volumes of things out to everyday consumers, I still question whether the technology is good enough to constantly cut features out just to get to a certain price point. And this Quest 3, while it is obviously on more expensive than Quest 2, there's way less trade-offs than I ever felt this device ever had. Now with Quest Pro, there was another thing that they were pushing pretty hard with that device. Well, really two things, but the main thing was it was their first mixed reality device, right? The first device that used cameras to do AR pass-through. If you looked at pretty much every single commercial for this device, and honestly, even this device, you would have assumed that everything you looked at in your real life view would have looked real to life, perfect, beautiful. But when you put on this headset and you just start doing some of the AR things, especially things with your hands and moving around, the they oversold it heavily. I would say it was really just not ready to be marketed in that way. Another thing this thing was not marketed to be at the time was, in my opinion, a heavy productivity tool for the masses. They pushed that you could replace your monitor with it, which is something I do believe heavily that these headsets are going to be able to do very well. But I think with this device, Meta rushed too early with it, and the marketing did not match the product. And even though there were some good concepts here, it still didn't make its mark and match the marketing and especially match its price. So I was disappointed, which probably made my review back then even more scathing. Now, Quest 3, though, it's very similar to Quest Pro. It takes a lot of the stuff that they probably learned from developing Quest Pro, because Quest Pro, from what I understand, was in the lab too long. They were trying to get it out pretty much a year before it actually did release. And the fact that it came out a year after it was planned due to COVID and all the other supply chain issues, it looked outdated on launch. Now, Quest 3 take some of the best things that they took with Quest Pro and improved them and made them more useful for the everyday user or even the everyday enthusiast, I would say. And I think the big thing all starts with the new chip inside. It uses a Qualcomm Snapdragon XR2 Gen 2, which is definitively more powerful, especially in the GPU side. And you notice that quite a bit. Even when streaming PCVR, you can bump up some of the values for your encoding and decoding to higher rates so you can get a better visual image. And that's really, really important because um, I've never been a huge fan of Wi-Fi based PCVR streaming, especially before there were options such as 10-bit encoding, which would sort of alleviate some of the color banding effects. But now it's getting to the point where we have Wi-Fi 6E, which means you have a better lower latency connection. You don't have to fight as hard with other devices in your house to connect to your PC to get that great signal. You have that 10-bit encoding again, which I value more than even like more bit rate because again, color banding I think is incredibly distracting in VR and VR experiences more than the actual visual clarity, even though they're both really important. Um, but yeah, it just really has gotten quite a bit better in these past couple years with all the new technologies improvements coming out. Now, obviously, this is a standalone headset, so you don't get only just the PCVR benefit, the smaller benefits from that. You get the actual fact that this is designed point one in blank to be using that chip to do everything on the headset. And I'll talk a little bit about that, my standalone experience later on in this video. But the big thing, especially, is the fact that when you have a new chip and you know from like an early point on, you're going to have this sort of performance boost, you can design the hardware around that chip. And I think that's where the big difference comes between the Quest 3 and the Quest Pro. Like, for example, my biggest issue with the Quest Pro, again, taking the fact they were marketing it as a monitor replacement, was the fact that they kept the same resolution in Quest Pro as the Quest 2. And while they did improve stuff such as the color gamut by adding that quantum dot layer in the LCD or the mini LED stack, which is actually the thing I miss the most going from Quest Pro to Quest 3 is the better color gamut. Trying to advertise it as a monitor replacement with that similar resolution to Quest 2 was just kind of silly in my opinion. I think you really need to get a higher resolution, higher pixels per degree to even get close to that advertisement for most people, even enthusiasts. I did not want to use that as a monitor replacement, for example, and I am a big fan of that concept. But the main reason probably why the Quest Pro had some big issues related to that and why they chose a very similar panel to Quest 2 is they felt constrained hardware design wise around that chip. It was basically the same chip as the Quest 2. They used the XR2 Gen 1 Plus, I believe is what they called it, or the XR2 Plus Gen 1. And it is basically the same chip as the Quest 2, but they moved the RAM off of the SoC to get better cooling and kind of clock things a little bit higher. But for the most part, same GPU and everything, and that really limited that hardware. Whereas this, they were able to pack in a much more powerful GPU, around 2 times as powerful. And while the chip is definitely notably power hungry, and some other stuff in here are pretty power hungry as well, it is a very noticeable difference in terms of like what resolutions they can push in standalone and really the actual displays that they put in here. They boosted the resolution 30% up from around 1800 by 1920 to I think it's around 2200 by 2000 or something, which is actually noticeable, especially if you stare at text and try to do the monitor replacement with this headset compared to Quest Pro. I think you will notice that text looks a lot sharper, even though it's a very small pixels per degree bump. In fact, since I'm already kind of talking about it, let's go right into the actual details about how I feel about the visuals and the optics and all that fancy stuff going on with the Quest 3. So if you go back to my Quest Pro review, even though it was a very scathing review, you can definitely tell that I appreciated the optics. That was probably the biggest thing. I think that might have been the only thing I said that was perfect, right? The perfect thing about the headset. For the Quest 3, they pretty much copy pasted those optics to this device with the new panel. And it still is the best part about this headset for sure. I still have not seen, at least in a consumer product, optics that are this good. I think they are fantastic. I think the edge-to-edge clarity is unbeatable. However, there are some things I noticed in sort of this headset compared to the Quest Pro's optics that I think they might have put in less coatings, or maybe it's actually the display choice more likely. This uses a standard LCD panel. It is not using a mini LED backlight, so you don't get any of that local dimming, which in my opinion, I know this is very controversial. I actually don't think local dimming is that good for VR headsets, because you're very limited to how many zones you have on these smaller panels. And I think blooming, especially for pancake lenses, is more distracting than just having the entire LCD black levels being pretty poor. Which, yes, I still think this is definitely an LCD panel, right? This is far from that micro OLED that I really love so much. You definitely notice the difference when you go from an OLED or micro OLED headset to this, especially with the lowered color gamut from this compared to the Quest Pro. Again, does not have that quantum dot layer. It probably does not reach that 100% DCI-P3 that you're starting to see from a lot of displays that do add a quantum dot layer. However, it is 100% sRGB from what I understand, which is still a good color gamut. I've heard from Pico 4 users that who switched from Pico 4 to Quest 3 is they did notice a better color reproduction. That's kind of lewd. Better colors than Pico 4 from what I've heard, but not popping out at you in my opinion. But it's still good. It's still fine, acceptable. But other benefits of using a mini LED panel is not only can you drive the brightness higher usually, but you can also have a lot more directional light for the most part, if I understand. So instead of using mini LEDs, this is a standard LCD backlight, which means it's edge lit. They put the LEDs on the side and just kind of send light all throughout the panel. It just kind of spreads everywhere outside the polarizers and the LCDs after that. So light kind of just goes wherever it wants. It's not as ideally directional as you can get from a mini LED backlight. So due to this, with a lot of optic systems that have standard LCD, especially when there's light bouncing around, you're not able to focus that light into a certain point, and stuff on the edges of the Quest 3 panel, I notice has quite a bit more noticeable chromatic aberration than you get with the Quest Pro's panels and optics. It's not a deal breaker, but it's just something I thought I would notice going from the Quest Pro to the Quest 3. It's not awful. Another thing, sacrificing from the mini LED to the standard LCD, is it doesn't get as bright as the Quest Pro's panel, or at least to your eyes. With the Quest Pro at 100% brightness, I was able to measure 100 nits to your eye directly at all white screen. With the Quest 3, I'm able to get maybe 85 nits to your eyes, which is only 15 less, which is not a huge problem in my opinion. I didn't even notice it until I did the exact measurements. And remember, when I did my big screen Beyond review, I measured around 80 nits at 100% brightness for that headset. But the big difference between that and this is, even though they're running at the same brightness, the persistence levels on the Quest 3 are not a problem at 100% brightness. It is very, very smooth to move your head around. Very good motion clarity, because the LCD, I guarantee, is able to drive much higher brightness than the actual micro OLED at a lower persistence level. So very good. I think the brightness is very acceptable. Now, something you might have noticed if you have a Quest 3, or maybe if you come from Quest Pro to Quest 3, very similar situation with the farther out you go toward the edges of the panel, the optics, it adds like a vignetting effect. It kind of darkens at the edges. Some people find that a deal breaker. For me, everything I'm saying here, all the negatives I'm saying about the display and optics, I still would prefer these optics to any other headset, for sure. In fact, I just wish that LCD technology, if they're going to use LCD, was able to push higher pixels per degree or higher resolutions, because I think the optics here are perfect. They have to be matched with 2.5-inch displays. That's very important to note. So you cannot just put a micro OLED panel in here unless it's that big, which is pretty much impossible right now. But I've seen at industry events, I've seen 4K panels, 4K by 4K per eye, at around that 2.5 inches. And if they stuck that with this optic, it would probably be very quite immersive. But Obviously, we're not there yet, and this is still a pretty good balance. Now, I do want to talk about display resolution because I have used this device a lot to kind of do productivity or look at my monitor. And while I do think it is vastly more usable due to the fact that that resolution bumped in the Quest Pro for that, it's still, it's just barely hitting 1080p monitors, I think. So to kind of put in perspective, my main monitor I use for my all day computing, it's a very large 32:9 aspect ratio monitor. It's basically, if you were to cut it in half, it basically would be two 1440p monitors at 27 inches, which is obviously a really good viewing, right? That's already higher than 1080p. And whenever I connect this headset to it, I usually have to bump down the monitor's resolution to that 1080p. Otherwise, text is too small. And yeah, it's just not a comfortable viewing experience for longer periods of time. My eyes will start to strain unless I make either the text sizing bigger, which for most operating systems messes up a lot of applications, or I just lower the resolution to 1080p, sacrifice some of that screen real estate, and get a better viewing experience. I was never able to enjoy my monitor at 1080p more enjoyably, I would say, on the Quest Pro. And the main reason I wouldn't recommend anything other than higher than 1080p digital screen for most software cases you run into is the SDE, or the screen door effect, is still visible when you are trying to stare at text. Now, it's obviously much better compared to something like the PSVR2 or older headsets because it's at a more acceptable resolution, but you need higher resolution technology and better display technology, I would say, to get rid of that screen door effect completely when you're doing these extreme case scenarios. And again, just like with Quest Pro, I complained about the fact that because they are counter-rotating the panels to get a little bit more FOV, that aliasing that comes from the rotated pixels makes the SDE somewhat more noticeable. In fact, a lot of people think that this is a sort of like a problem with their panel, like they got a bad panel or something. But no, that those sort of diagonal lines you see in the image is because of the rotated pixels and the rendering that has to happen for that. So it is kind of distracting when you're trying to stare at fine lines, including at edges of UI elements or fine text. There is that sort of screen door effect. No easy way to mesh the pixels together without just upgrading to better panels. If you're an everyday 1080p user, or you've never had a monitor higher than 1080p, I can definitely imagine you at least trying to do all your work in a headset. Because if you think about the price per value here, $500 gives you, in theory, if operating systems were more designed for this task, it gives you as many 1080p monitors as you want for $500. That's a pretty good price per performance ratio. Now the problem is there's not many. There's not really good ways to just create digital screens, unless you use some of the apps that do it, like Immersed. I will say Immersed and Facebook Meta Horizon Workrooms or whatever. They do let you create digital monitors, but this would probably require a whole video. But those platforms, while they're very good for what they're designed for, I still have different requirements or different wishes that I want from a spatial computing environment. That I think those things are very good at what they do, very good at what they focus on, but I still feel very limited as a user who maybe thinks too much in the future. I know it's a very cynical and egotistical thing to say, but yeah, that's a whole other video. But yeah, you definitely can use this maybe if you're used to 1080p, but anything higher, I don't know. It's still not there yet, obviously, and it's not marketed toward that. But I just thought I would talk about it. One other thing you might notice with the Quest 3 visuals is you might see what looks to be like a Mura effect. And before I say this, it's nowhere near as bad or anywhere similar to as bad as something you get from a PSVR 2 or other older OLED HMDs back in the day. But it is kind of present, especially when you stare at big solid colors and you move your head around. You will notice that there is just this sort of weird levels of brightness across your image as you move your head. And it's not distracting most of the time, but you will see it sometimes. But other than that, again, the visuals of this headset's displays and optics paired together, especially when I'm in a VR environment or anything related to VR chat or some of the standalone games, visuals still look really good. I think, again, if I were to take this over, I would take this headset's visuals over most other headsets for sure. Even some other headsets that claim to have the best visuals in the world, the fact that they're using pancake optics, despite the fact that it's lower brightness and some of these other factors that kind of introduce itself with this setup, I think the value is way better than most headsets on the market, even with all the problems that I explained before. Very good optic and display setup, and only gets better as display technology catches up. And hopefully Meta explores other display technologies too to kind of solve some of the other side effects there. It would be almost a sin to talk about a standalone headset without trying out a standalone game, and probably the most newest one that everyone's kind of talking about, and that would be Assassin's Creed. It's kind of my look into this headset and how things can be done with the much more powerful GPU that's inside compared to the Quest 2. And overall, the graphics, I would say, when a AAA developer, for example, is able to take advantage of the higher render resolution the GPU can handle and all these other things, playing Assassin's Creed Nexus, the VR version of Assassin's Creed, it reminded me a lot of playing a VR game from 2016 PC VR, maybe on like the lowest minimum grade, like a 970 or something. And that sounds pretty rough, you know, if you're obviously a PC VR enthusiast, but I'm telling you, it's I would much prefer things look like that than they did even before this. That was kind of always my issue. As I started VR in 2016, I got this sort of idea of what VR quality and rendering should look like, and then they would release the Quest 1 and Quest 2, and games were just so far behind that sort of starting reference for me that it just looked bad. So if you started VR later than that, the graphics are still obviously nowhere near the current modern day PC VR experience, but it's more closer to like a PS4 Pro, like PSVR on a PS4 Pro or something, when things are going well. And that being said, that game in particular, Assassin's Creed Nexus, they are doing a trick called application space warp, where they're constantly rendering the game at 45 frames per second and then constantly reprojecting based on your movements to 90 hertz, which does introduce some micro stutter in my experience too, which is pretty frustrating. Not really, it doesn't make me nauseous, and it doesn't make me feel uncomfortable compared to like the reprojection system on PSVR 2, or that made me feel really just out of it. But the micro stutter is there for that game that I noticed even on the Quest 3, and that would make me miss some stuff. So yeah, I still think compute power and GPU power could still be improved. And I know it's early days. Usually developers figure out how to harness that power better and optimize for it. But if you are wanting to buy a device, Quest 3 right now, you do get at least a 2016 low-end PC level of graphics if developers care enough, which is, you can decide whether or not that's beneficial to you. But I use this thing as PC VR headset, and being able to render things on PC VR headset, even at a higher resolution than the Quest 2 panels, things look really, really good for gaming and social VR and stuff. Since we're talking about this idea of doing a lot of things long-term and spending a lot of time in headsets to the point where you can maybe replace a monitor, let's talk about, well, comfort, because you might have a good enough screen, but if you're not able to wear the device comfortably, that is a problem, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about industrial design. And I think the industrial design of this headset is borderline acceptable, but barely. So you see here, this is not how the Quest 3 comes out of the box, right? You get this whole front unit, but this whole back thing is an accessory that I deem pretty much important and necessary if you want to use this thing for long periods of time. Not this exact one, but anything that requires or has counterweight and an extra battery in the back, I think is incredibly important for the Quest 3. So the Quest 3 comes with a soft strap very similar to the Quest 2 out of the box. And While I will say, due to the fact that they're using pancake lenses and they get some more components closer to your face, due to the fact they're also using pancake lenses, also means they needed to put a much larger, heavier battery in the front unit. Because remember, we were talking about brightness a little bit ago and how much brightness needs to be driven for these pancake lenses. You don't just have a more power hungry SoC in the headset, but you also have these displays that need to be driven at much higher brightnesses just to compensate for the pancake optics. So you have a nearly double size of battery in this thing compared to the Quest 2, which adds more weight, which is why even though this is a much thinner headset, the weight is actually slightly larger than the Quest 2. And when you have a soft strap that does not do any counterbalance to your head, I think putting this battery up front, while it definitely saves manufacturing costs and makes it much easier for people to assemble this headset at the factory, I really wish they were able to put the battery in the back, even if it only removed 20% of the weight, and just adds a little more counterbalance to it, because this thing, in my opinion, is extremely front heavy. And for most people I've talked to, they have had to ditch the soft strap completely, just like a lot of people who would end up not shelving this thing or putting it in the closet after using it for a day would also do for their Quest 2. Now, if you don't have much money, you have, I always think having a 3D printer and being a VR enthusiast always goes very hand in hand. And some things that if you don't have a lot of money laying around, you get a Quest 3, you can like 3D print like a TPU thing that attaches to your soft strap that gives you at least a better cup behind your head. But even trying this, for the most part, I still think anything with a counterweight on the back of the head is important. And we'll probably see how that goes with Apple too, because I think that's kind of another thing, right? It's reported that Apple's headset is similar weight. The front unit is similar weight to the Quest 3. We'll see if whatever they're doing with strap here is better, but yeah. Other things related to industrial design, and I think this is the most important note about the Quest 3 over the Quest Pro, is the Quest Pro, if it was uncomfortable for you, as it was for me, there is very little you can do. Very little you can do to change the head strap to actually form to your head. And I think that is the biggest issue with the Quest Pro's industrial design. Now, there is one thing you can do that I saw a lot of people who bought a Quest Pro could do, was they would add this top strap called the globular cluster. It's very popular among the Quest Pro community. And this is all you can do. And while it improved comfort for me a little bit on this headset, it still didn't solve some of the other problems I had with it. And I think unibody with no interchangeability is a terrible idea for something so personal as VR. And with Quest 3, if you don't like the default strap, you could just remove it and replace it. With Quest 3, if you don't like a closed design, eventually I'll get this off. If you don't like a closed design, guess what? I've seen a lot of head straps already come out that allows you to get that open design similar to the Quest Pro. So this idea that you have to design only one unchangeable industrial design for one use case instead of just designing a very variable design that can be changed and DIY to whatever comforts the user, way better industrial design than Quest Pro, which is wild, because I think Quest Pro was so over-engineered to the point where it's not only just unrepairable beyond belief, but also just interchangeable. Again, if I was to make any change to the Quest 3, I would have removed the battery and make it... honestly, I would just remove the battery from the front and just release an interchangeable strap with the battery in the back that even connects to a wire. I don't care if the wire looks bad to some people. I think comfort and industrial design, that variability of what you can do with the user, extremely important. So yes, much better than Quest Pro, but still a lot of room for improvement in terms of comfort. A lot of people also complain about the facial interface itself. A lot of people say it's very abrasive to their skin. And while I can see that feeling, I think I'm maybe the face shape where I actually like this more than the silicone version silicone version that they actually sell. I bought the silicone facial pad just to try it out, and I ended up liking this more. Now, I wish it was more fabric-like, something similar to the Valve Index facial interface. That's always been the best fabric that I've had on my face for a VR headset. But a lot of people have complained about this. But for me, not as big of a deal. Again, VR is very personal, and everyone's got different face shapes and sizes. It's crazy. So that probably leads us to the next very heavy personal opinion sort of thing, and that is controllers. So I'm going to hold up two controllers here. One is the Quest Pro right controller, and one is the Quest 3 right controller. And the biggest difference, other than the fact that no longer is an Oculus logo, the system button, but now it's a full-fledged Meta logo. Rest in peace, Oculus. The biggest difference is this has cameras on it, which self-tracks everywhere you move it, for the most part, as long as it's not dark in your room, because these are cameras, and you need light for cameras to operate, even IR-based cameras. These have no cameras. They have a ring of LEDs here and an extra LED on the bottom because that makes the computer vision a lot easier. But also, these are much lighter than the Quest Pro controllers. But due to the fact they don't have their own cameras, they are not self-tracked easily. Now, if we take a look at the actual headset here, the actual cameras that are doing tracking of things such as your hands or controllers are here, 1, 2, and here, 3, 4. That's it. So if you do anything related to moving your hands above your head or anything like that, you will lose tracking. Now, this is a very controversial thing. For me, I don't play games like Beat Saber. I don't do anything that intense in terms of VR at all. In fact, I mostly do a lot of social VR, and maybe once in a while I'll do something like the new Assassin's Creed game that came out, or some of the bigger titles. I don't spend too much time doing competitive Beat Saber, and I think that's the biggest one that I've heard complaints about. These controllers are probably not as good for that compared to the Quest 2 controllers, which have a much wider range of tracking on not just the Quest 2, because look how they arrange their cameras, but also that ring, the computer vision could be a bit better there. So while I haven't had an issue, I've heard some people, if you're really into high competitive Beat Saber, you might have problems with this. But I think it's also important to note, if you do have problems with tracking volume, which in my opinion, I do value tracking volume heavily. I've come from a Lighthouse SteamVR base station setup. Anytime I lose any sort of tracking on my controllers, that includes these, it just takes me out of it. It feels bad. And that's why I have these. I still do use these with my Quest 3, because guess what? You can actually pair the Quest Pro controllers with your Quest 3. For the majority of users, I think you will not care to do that. But for me, I like it. I like these controllers more than the Quest 3. But I still want to talk about a couple other things that obviously benefit this over the Quest Pro controllers, and that's battery life. They're very similar. If you ever had a Quest 2 controller, they last for months. The battery life, very low power, very good if you don't like charging stuff. And there's another thing that's beneficial here, and this is a fantastic industrial design from Meta. And while I don't have the accessory here to show you, you take off the battery cover, and there's this little slot here that you can place in different accessories. Like obviously this is the base one that comes in the box. It's the wrist pad, but there's also ones to make it like an index controller, where it'll constantly hold on to your hand as long as you slot it in there, and then it replaces the battery cover door. I did not like Meta's fabric they used for that, so I ended up not using those. But I think the industrial design of the actual people who design these controllers, and like thought ahead of what kind of accessories people might want to use with those controllers, I think that is perfect, and makes me very sad that there is nothing like that for the Quest Pro controllers. If you want to have, for example, grips on your hands with the Quest Pro controllers, you have to usually get a silicone cover that wraps around the top, and usually when you are doing anything motion-wise, that silicone usually bends off of the top, and it's just not as good of a design as what you would have with that battery door design. So yeah, I think these controllers are very good. And in fact, I always feel The thing I'm most impressed with, other than the optics from Meta's hardware engineering teams, has been their controllers. I think they've been doing probably the best job compared to maybe even their headset division, which I know some of those people probably watch my channel and they're probably like being smug right now. But yeah, seriously, the people who've been designing Meta controllers and designing all the systems related to that, you guys have been doing a fantastic job. So well done. Really impressed. Keep it on. Give me more of this though. I really I think you guys are really close with something amazing here. Because if we didn't have those controllers, we would have to rely on something else with the Quest 3, and it's something that I think everyone gets impressed with like first day or maybe even first month, honestly. And that's the hand tracking, not using controllers and using your hands. And this is something that I also want to make a whole video about, but I'm going to touch on it briefly here. So I think the hand tracking in this headset, it's still better than the hand tracking I've experienced with Quest Pro and obviously Quest 2. But it still has a lot that needs to be improved on. I don't want to go into it too much, as I said, but you can feel how hand tracking can be useful in some cases, but I also feel that when you start getting to tracking your hands and even your eyes, which will be a whole other topic someday, that's almost getting into brain-computer interface territory. Because there's a lot of times where you think the hand tracking is going to be very useful for a certain use case, but the computer vision in the headset cannot predict what you're trying to do in a certain case. So when you want to click something, or maybe you don't even want to click something, but your hands are kind of just at your side or at some place and it's just relaxing, or maybe you're just twiddling your thumbs because you're just kind of a weirdo and doing that. It's very annoying. In fact, it's gotten to the point where I actually turned off the auto change between controllers and hands because I just got tired of the hand tracking systems not understanding my intent. And it's not really the hand tracking system's fault. It's just the fact that, one, the operating system in the Quest is still far from being a hand tracking first system. It's clearly designed from controllers from the ground up. And while they constantly keep updating it to kind of give you more hand tracking controller based features, it still is a lot to be desired. Not only that, so if you actually do want to use your controllers or your hands to actually select stuff, for example, maybe you're using the big screen version of the UI where you have to pinch to actually select something, which is most apps. If there's anything related to controlling your desktop from your Quest, most apps are doing it that way, the pinch to click. And the hand tracking is not precise enough to understand that when you're pinching to select something, that laser should stay right where it is. So you end up doing the pinch gesture, it lifts the laser and completely misses the UI element you're trying to select. And there's a lot, I know that sounds like a really minor thing, but the current state of hand tracking technology and the current state of software related to hand tracking technology is still very far from being an all-day use case. Not only that, there is a depth sensor inside of this thing. And what the depth sensor does, this is something the Quest Pro was supposed to have, but it got cut pretty much at the last minute. Funny thing is that actually the depth sensor in here, if you took it out, you could actually slot it in perfectly to where the depth sensor was supposed to be in the Quest Pro, but it won't work if you do that. Yeah, so they use the depth sensor for almost nothing, as far as I can tell. The only time they use the depth sensor is literally with their special room setup feature, which I ended up not really using much because just like I was kind of complaining about my hand tracking and everything, while it is something that seems like a really good feature, the software is not good enough to understand my intent. And the same happens for that room setup with the depth sensor. It gives me a recommended size of room or how I want to play that experience or the next couple experiences. But usually I don't like what it's suggesting. Maybe it's too small or even too large in some cases, but usually too small. Then I would just switch to the old one and mark out my territory manually, which makes the depth sensor useless in that case. Same thing happens. It's not smart enough to know my intent. And one thing I'm disappointed about the depth sensor, it's basically what the depth sensor only does is it spreads out IR everywhere. to kind of improve the actual IR cameras that are looking around your room and marking things out. For a lot of, it's well known that a lot of companies use these IR projectors to improve their hand tracking in low light situations. But as far as I can tell, and I've been testing it so much, I know some people, I think there was even some public comments saying that the depth sensor will activate in some low light conditions. From all of my testing, I've never been able to get the depth sensor to just activate in low light scenarios to improve certain things. And hand tracking would be one of those things that it would improve, because even in well lit rooms, I would say is well lit, like a bedroom with just the ceiling light on, I would get this warning that the hand tracking needs better lighting. And again, just frustrates me the depth sensor is used for so little. And also, it would be even more important for another feature that the Quest 3 does not have, and that is occlusion. So a headset that I've tried, the Vario XR3, does amazing occlusion with their, I believe they use their LiDAR sensor, or maybe even their Ultra Leaps IR projector. What occlusion is if there's a digital object being overlaid in your AR environment, you hold up your hand, it will actually cut out almost near perfectly your real life hand on top of that virtual environment. So it looks like that virtual object is at the correct distance. Instead of having a digital representation of your hand, it looks more realistic for AR. And it's one of those things that it doesn't sound like a big deal, but when you first try it and see it out when it's working, occlusion makes AR way more useful than just having just a weird cartoon digital hand in your AR environment. Way more immersive, I guess. And I know some people don't care about AR, but it's something I really want to point out. Now, there is one experience that I've tried with the Meta Quest 3 that does try to do hand occlusion. And it was, I believe it is actually the new version of First Hand's demo. And it's awful. The Quest 3's hand occlusion in that demo is so poor. And when you pair it with the reprojection artifacting that you get from the camera pass-through, which I'm going to talk about camera pass-through also in this video very soon, it actually made me nauseous looking at my hands and doing something that's purely focused on hands. I had to stop that demo because it's just the mixture of really bad occlusion and that whole horrible distortion you get from the hand stuff. Really bad. So I ended up being glad that the Quest 3, everything else about the Quest 3 did not have that occlusion, because it just made me feel so uncomfortable. Because again, a lot of stuff that requires your hands, or any mixed reality demos that use your hands, you're going to be staring at your hands a lot. You're going to be staring at near field objects a lot. So it's really important that you nail those two things perfectly. You got to nail the actual reprojection from near field objects, and you have to nail the occlusion perfectly. Otherwise, you go back into the dark ages of VR before we go into stuff like, I don't know, I would even say low persistence was discovered, because it feels like that. In fact, let's just go right into the pass-through in general, the pass-through quality. So this uses what they'll call two 4-megapixel cameras, color cameras. But the interesting thing is, and this is something that's not completely well known by the mass majority of the community, these are actually the same cameras as the single color camera in the Quest Pro, the same model. You might be like, well, wait, Brad, I thought that was a 16-megapixel color camera. And yeah, it actually is. These are two 16-megapixel sensors. But what they do is they do something called binning, which they actually make 4 of those pixels into one to get sort of a better light. When you use 4 pixels on a sensor, it basically makes those small pixels into one bigger pixels to let in more light. So even though it's a 16 megapixel camera, it's effectively only being used 4 megapixels. And also, there's benefits of doing that. You get usually a better color reproduction than just using 2 4-megapixel cameras straight out. However, these are still very small sensors, very, very, very small camera sensors. Like, I think they're 1/3 of an inch, which means even with that binning of the pixels to try to get more light to come into your cameras, they are still not able to get much light in there. In fact, I still stand by this. Using the mixed reality pass-through indoors for most of my house is a grainy mess, and it's not very enjoyable. I go outside, daylight, And again, you gotta be careful when you're going out in daylight with headsets. You gotta make sure none of the sun is touching the inside lenses. If it's not, you're totally fine. But going outside and using the pass-through outside, it's a good experience. It really does kind of show you like, okay, I can see how pass-through could be really useful if all those things with low light could be improved, and maybe the megapixels can be improved even further than what it is, make the camera sensor bigger, have more high dynamic range. There's a lot of things that can be improved from the pass-through, but unlike the Quest Pro's pass-through, which I felt was basically unusable, and maybe like Oculus Dev Kit 1 in terms of like how useful the pass-through was for that device, I would say the pass-through in this device is closer to how useful VR was back in the HTC Vive days. It's just passable for the mega enthusiasts to do stuff, but for the vast majority of people, I think, that try it and put it on, they're not going to be using it long term. They're going to be like, wow, this is amazing for like maybe a month, and then they're just going to be like, I'm kind of getting tired of the grain. I don't really want to do this all the time. But it gives you an understanding of where things are going and why it's valuable, because I actually do think I'm much more respectful of the idea of doing pass-through focus headsets with this, whereas with the Quest Pro, I felt that device actually hurt the way I viewed pass-through AR. So yes, that is why I think it's really important, if you're going to release a product, make sure it does not poison the well, because the Quest Pro kind of did that for almost a year for me. I thought pass-through AR was still way further off than it was, but this is a bit closer, even though I still think it's not a reason. It's not a reason to buy this. It's not a reason to buy this. You want to buy this as a VR device, because that gets us into the next thing. This is still a VR-focused device for the most part. The software. Let's talk about the software. And I was kind of touching on it a little bit earlier. The software in the Quest 3 is annoying. So, and this is really unfair, because I know I'm coming from someone who uses Steam VR, and Steam VR is currently in a really annoying stance in itself. It's like extreme teething problems right now. But the thing is, with the Quest software, well, let's start with the first thing you do when you get a new Quest. You put it on, you turn it on, and what it tells you to do is to get out your phone, install an app, and go through a setup process in your application on your phone. And I always think that is the worst. It makes zero sense to me why it requires a phone to set up. Now, that's not the base complaint with the actual operating system of the Quest 3, but that kind of idea is what I think all the other problems I have with the Quest OS sort of comes from. It always feels like that this device's software is never designed thoughtfully. And even when things are working, it always feels like there's something not working. Like the UI constantly is changing with every update, and I know that's become a meme from longtime users, but if you've not used a Quest for a while, I actually, when I got my Quest Pro out to do some A and B comparisons, I was actually shocked by how different the UI changed since that Quest Pro was maybe like 5 versions ago, which is only like months old compared to what it is now. And there's still so many teething problems with the OS in terms of bugs. Like, you constantly run into bugs that would shock you. And when I ask people who have been doing Quest a lot longer than I have, more full time than I am, they would say this bug has existed for a couple years now. And then I see them also change some of the stuff in the OS to better reflect what the new device is designed for. And the biggest complaint as well, going with all that, before I turn to ranting mode, is the default applications on the Quest 3 are also very non-indicative of what their long-term plans seem to be. So Meta's first-party apps are so bare bones and little on the platform that you would be shocked to know that they are spending as much money they are on this sort of industry, right? When you buy a new smartphone, for example, you buy a new Samsung phone, you buy a new Apple iPhone, you buy whatever, you always have this interpretation that once you boot up the phone for the first time, you're going to have a suite of different apps to do everything you want to do, or maybe things that you don't even know you want to do, but you are going to be using it daily. And the Quest 3, it's got a browser and an app store. That's kind of all I noticed, right? There's no first party apps that make you feel like, okay, this could be a device that I use for more than just gaming. It's still very game console focused in terms of software, and it's really shocking because a lot of times when you see Meta's marketing, they never treat this device as a game console. A lot of marketing for the most part, or any of their products, they always treat it as like the next big thing in computing. But the suite of apps and like the OS that they built for this device has never felt like they have that grand vision. And I think it's a big missed opportunity. I think they should be working hard on creating a suite of first party apps that make people think, wow, okay, I can see how this could be useful. Like, when the Apple headset's coming out, they're porting all of the main apps that people use, like Maps and like Keynote and everything. Those are going to be usable on that headset. And while it's obviously a much more expensive headset, and Apple has the benefit of having this ecosystem where they've already developed those apps, Meta wants to compete with that. And I just have not seen from the software OS level or the suite of apps level, that they're anywhere close to that. And I think that should be something they really focus on if they ever do want to do a Quest Pro 2, for example, because this hardware is very good. And if they use this as a base for Quest Pro 2, it could be a really killer device. But if they don't have the software, that's a problem. There's also no 2D App Store, obviously. I think that's a big problem, and it seems like something they've only just realized they need to focus on recently from public comments. Mixed reality. Let's talk about mixed reality a little bit more, because mixed reality is kind of a weird place right now where I think it's very similar to room scale VR and how it was pushed early on in the VR days. So the big thing with room scale VR was the idea that you could have a certain room size and a certain dimensions of that room and design software perfectly to match that. Now, it seemed like a really good idea for like, in fact, it was actually really immersive. Anyone who's tried room scale experiences designed for like maybe a 2x2 meter play space back then, they would tell you this was awesome. Like even the game Job Simulator, for example, a game that kind of sets you in a square box with things to interact with. That game even had a system where it had a variety of sizes and shapes that based on what your room setup was, it would change the size of and the shape of your actual facility you were doing your job in. And it was really immersive and amazing. And people kept getting confused, like, why does your job simulator look so different than the one I do in my room? And it was because the room size and shape was different. But the truth is, as time went on, people realized that developers just don't have the ability to make compelling experiences when they got to make so many different room shapes and sizes. Maybe those games where you stand in a single place work out, but any game that is just, or any experience that is just wants to be more than that, it's so difficult for a developer to design that way. So room scale VR games pretty much for the most part kind of died, at least that concept of it. It's mostly lives on today as, you do stuff such as maybe you have a board you place in a VR room, like a tabletop thing, or most games it's kind of that, or that's it. Anything else is joystick, which does not require you to have a certain play space or room. Developers are not designing any VR game with a joystick as artificial locomotion to take advantage of your room space or size. Mixed reality games and experiences for the most part are basically two things right now. One, they might be trying to do the room scale thing where they actually take account your walls in your room and everything, but then they just either turn into a wave shooter or they just turn that wall into a virtual space in itself, which is fine for a sort of prototyping phase, but I think a lot of consumers will just find that gimmicky. And I think the current state of mixed reality's main use will be tabletop games or things you pop up in your environment and can play together in the same space as other people if you can share that anchor points. But the biggest thing of all that most consumers, I think, will understand the value of mixed reality, and this is the frustrating thing for most people who've been big into the immersive side of VR, and that's the fact that popping up 2D windows or 2D games or 2D things, maybe even making them the 3D movies or more volumetric 2D screens and stuff like that, that is probably still the best use case, I think, that isn't a gimmick with mixed reality in its current state, other than just like seeing where you are before you switch to a VR game, right? And I just don't think Meta has any apps that really take advantage of that for the most part, except a few. Now, there's been some cool experiments I've seen related to mixed reality, but for the most part, they're very sandboxy, and I think sandboxy stuff works as well with mixed reality. But I just think it's hard to expect developers to be able to design around a ton of different rooms, at least for gaming. At least for gaming, it's hard to expect developers to design around a variety of different rooms and shapes and sizes. And even the fact that when I go outside, for example, if I want to use this thing outside in AR and stuff, the software expects me to mark out 4 different walls. Well, if I'm outside at the park or something using my headset, there's no walls to mark out, and it won't let me do those experiences. So, yeah, it's hardware and software are not really matching in that situation. Now let's talk about battery life. Battery life is also pretty crazy low. When I did the newest Assassin's Creed game without the external battery that I attached to it, I got around an hour and a half of gameplay with just the internal battery, which, depending on how you feel about gaming, that might seem like a very short period of time. And I've even seen people complain about the Assassin's Creed game, and they're using a third-party op called I think it's called Quest Game Optimizer, which will allow them to unlock their GPU further and give them better render resolution and stuff on standalone. And yeah, that will give you even less battery than that 1.5 hours that I marked out. Now, if you're using mixed reality to do productivity, that 1 hour and 30 minutes goes down to around just an hour in my experience. Because remember, those cameras are running all the time. And if you've ever held out your smartphone and we're just recording video on it, that 7 to 8 hours of battery life goes down to like maybe 2 or 3 hours on a smartphone. So it's a very similar situation. These batteries are power hungry, even though they're not the. Did I say batteries? These cameras are power hungry, even though they're not just the highest and greatest sort of thing. So you are gonna, I still think, want an external battery, or do what I do. And this might sound crazy to you, but most of the time I use the Quest 3, I'm tethered directly to a wall plug because I think that just makes me not have to worry about battery life at all. And that just feels nice. Another small thing to talk about is audio. Well, it's half small and half big. This is probably the thing I hate the most about the device, actually. And this might sound crazy. The microphone audio is so far behind some of the other headsets I use daily before this, which boggles my mind because I know Meta their big thing is social features, right? Their social VR, their social platform. And while I've heard some people say it's okay, it just is still really far from what I would expect a social VR company to want to prioritize. I would think if you were releasing a headset where you expect people to live in, or not live, but interact in a metaverse constantly, talking to people, socializing with people, the first thing you would want to focus on is microphone quality. And for me, the microphone pops a lot, but also just the whole quality just kind of sounds like through a tin can most of the time. And I'm reminded of this every time I use it because I again, most people have talked to me in social VR through an index or even a big screen beyond. And in the month and a half I've been using the Quest 3, I would go into my friends' lobbies and VR chat. And I'm not even kidding when I say this. Every single time, daily, I would go into this lobby, people would be like, "Ooh, what headset are you using?" And it's because they have to suffer the microphone quality, the lowered microphone quality that they expect compared to other headsets I've used. And that drives me nuts. Speakers are acceptable. I think they're better than Quest 2. They're not amazing, but they're good. I think they're fine, right? They give a little bit of spatial audio, not the highest tier of spatial audio, but again, we're talking about $500 here. It's hard to complain about it, but it's really the microphone that I think is the big killer about this device more than anything else. I can literally change anything else about this headset to make it better for me, but that microphone audio is the biggest problem. Because hey, if I didn't like the speakers in the headset here, there is an audio jack here, and I can use a third party device or even whatever for that. So very frustrating. All right, I do want to finish this video. I know this is already probably like an hour-long video, and it's probably very podcasty, but I do want to give my final thoughts about it. And even though I have nitpicked a lot about this video, about this device in this video, obviously that's what I do, right? I do like this device. I still stand by the fact that this is by far the most useful device that Meta has released for VR. I think it's really good. I think I like it more than the Quest Pro in most ways. Obviously, it does not have IR face tracking, and I think the lack of eye tracking is really the biggest thing I think is a real problem for this device long term. But you know, yeah, that's really unfortunate. I can get away with not having face tracking in most headsets, but not having eye tracking severs a lot of possibilities for better input, like sort of that brain computer interfacing features I talked about later on. Because again, intent is important, and you'd be surprised how much intent your eyes can convey more than just your fingers. But also, everything else about this headset I think is way better designed. If you are someone who likes the Quest 2, and use it a lot, I'm not talking about those people who bought a Quest 2 and shelve it. I think it's actually a no-brainer to upgrade to Quest 3. I wouldn't touch any of the other Meta headsets other than the Quest 3. Now, if you're coming from an Index, for example, this is where things get a little more complicated because for me, if you just got money around, I think a Quest 3 is a pretty easy upgrade from an Index in most ways, mostly visually. And if you like the idea of doing things wireless, I think for the most part, the wireless VR experience is not perfect, but it's still in a very good place these days. Obviously far from wired, but if you are an Index user, you either are looking at this or the big screen beyond, and that's the thing is I'm either using this or the big screen beyond. I'm constantly going between the two full time because I like different things about each headset. And when I go back to the big screen beyond, I miss the optics in this headset more than anything. I miss the built-in audio in this headset more than anything, even though the microphone is garbage. But the big screen beyond is so light and gives me all the benefits of tethered and the Steam VR tracking ecosystem that I prefer that more. So it's really what your use case is. But unlike with the Quest Pro, where I vehemently did not really recommend it for most people, and a lot of people gave me flack back then for that. And remember, when I reviewed it, it was a $1,500 device. Now it's officially a $1,000 device, but you can buy on eBay for like $500. I hear a lot of the time. This device, I think, is a good value. Yeah, I think it's good. It's still as all VR hardware still needs a lot more improvements, and I think a lot of stuff here it still does as well. But it's good. It's a good headset. Yeah. If you enjoyed this video and thought it was a very useful educational video, please consider subscribing to my Patreon, bradsmells.com/Patreon. This channel is so far from profitable. I need to get that a little bit closer to that profitable mark, but nothing in VR is profitable for the most part. There's so many instances where you hear about VR and you're just like, how the heck does it make money? Well, it doesn't. This thing's subsidized. Well, you know, that's how it is. But yeah, if you like it, please support me. Bye.